217th Reading Online Sports Economics Seminar. Last week we had Tadeo giving his first ever Roses talk, and today Stefan reclaimed his crown as the most frequent Roses presenter with 7. I've got 6, so you've overtaken me again, Stefan. Stefan is going to present his paper, which has the there is today, as the title, The Impact of TV's Rollout on Baseball in the US and Soccer in England. Just before he does, just a reminder that we are sponsored generously by the Sports Economics Review, the journal that Stefan is the editor of, and it is a very generous sponsorship indeed. And I put in the reminder, yes, I did. So in the reminder, you'll have seen that April 28th to 30th is going to be the first Central Asia Conference on Sports Science in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, which will also be an event sponsored by the Sports Economics Review. And so if you like the idea of visiting the Silk Route, Tashkent, very interesting places, do have a look there. There's a website and a abstract deadline, January the 25th, and I've begun to start putting in other conferences that are scheduled for next summer. There is the Fairness in Sport workshop in Budapest in June, as there's also the Political Studies Association Sport and Politics Conference at Liverpool University, and the Athens University of Economics and Business Sports Analytics workshop and conference in May. And at some point, we'll get the date confirmed for the next Gijón Sports Economics Conference. Without any further ado, Stefan, please do take away your talk. I assume that you're happy to take questions as you go along.
Yes, absolutely.
Fantastic. All yours.
Okay, let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, is that working?
It is, yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so this is something I've been working on really on and off for quite a lot for the last year or so in one form or another. I've been sort of working on sort of different ideas of the thesis that I want to present, but today my chance to really try it out on an audience for the first time. So this is the structure of what I'm going to say. I'll explain my thesis. This is about TV and the 1950s in the US and the UK, and its impact on baseball in the US and English soccer, football. I'll explain the post-war attendance crisis, the relationship between TV and attendance. But then really the focus is on the impact on the number of teams, and I'll explain this idea of the fold probability, the likelihood that English teams were going to fold, and really the central question at the end is, why did minor league baseball teams in the US fold when teams in the English Football League didn't? So let me explain my thesis. So Acemoglu, Johnson, Robinson got the Nobel Prize for in large part their work on trying to explain how economic development is affected by institutions. What are institutions? Well, they use the definition of Douglas North: institutions, the rules of the game in a society humanly devised. If you want to identify the impact of institutions, you really need some kind of exogenous shock. And what they do is really distinguish between two kinds of institution, the extractive institutions which favored a dominant class, a small segment of society, and defended their property rights and their property rights alone, versus sort of settler colonial institutions which defended a broad-based cross-section of society with basic legal rights and property rights, and that they argue that these represented the imposition of these systems by colonialists, European colonialists from the 16th century onwards, represents an exogenous imposition of a system, and they argue that these led to different economic outcomes, with the better economic outcomes essentially coming with the broad-based protections. So by analogy, what I'm arguing here is that TV was the exogenous shock to professional sports, and it occurred at the same time in the US and the UK. The two dominant sports were baseball and football in each country, and TV had a significant negative impact on both attendance and team economics in both cases, as I will explain as we go along. But the big difference is in the US, most of the minor league teams folded and disappeared, whereas essentially all of the English football clubs survived. And that's the difference that I want to explain. And I want to explain that used by claiming that these are due to institutional differences. Pro baseball was a self-governing structure dominated by the major leagues. They had an antitrust exemption, and there was limited incentive for minor league teams that were losing money not to fold. Whereas in England, the professional football was governed by the Football Association, which regulated the Football League, albeit fairly lightly, and the institution of promotion and relegation ensured both competition at all levels of the game and providing an incentive to preserve loss-making teams. Okay, so first, let's look at the advent of TV in the US and the UK. TV obviously had a major impact has impacted societies across the world and represented a fundamental change. And the interesting thing is that in Britain and the United States, it happened at roughly the same time. So in 1950, less than 10% of households in either country has a television. By 1960, it's close to 90% in the US and 2/3 in the UK. So the UK was slightly slower, but by the mid-60s, we're at saturation. So in many ways, but this is perhaps surprising to people, we're used to thinking of the UK as now being somewhat behind technologically the United States, but back then, actually, they were kind of more or less in lockstep. And one of the things that's that's useful for the US is there's been some significant research in recent years documenting the precise rollout of TV across the United States. And here is a chart from a paper by Fenton and Koenig, which illustrates the coverage of television or the reach of TV stations between 1948 and 1960 by US counties. And what you can see is in 1948, there is television in most of the major urban centers, but outside of that, there's almost no coverage. And by 1960, pretty much every county, every populated county in the United States, remember there are about 3,000 counties in the United States. So pretty much every county has TV. And one of the things that I'm going to use in my analysis here is data on this county level data for the United States to measure the extent of TV coverage and its potential impact on minor league teams. Now, there isn't the equivalent for the UK is something that actually not quite as detailed, but I have collected this year, and it's actually available from BBC yearbooks, which you can find online. And what this shows here is by English counties, the penetration of television between 1949 and 1966. And in the UK, if you owned a television, you were required to purchase a license, and you still are today, and that license fee is intended to fund the operations of the BBC, the state broadcaster. And the BBC published the number of licenses by county from the early 50s until the mid 1960s. Actually, the data before 1954, I was able to obtain from the BBC archive, which interestingly is only open to journalists. So I had to ask a journalist friend to get me the data, but he did. So that was that. And you can see here, we've got quite a lot of counties, and the pattern though is almost identical everywhere. This sort of fairly rapid penetration, and by 1960, you've reached sort of saturation levels. And just to give you an impression, the dots on this map are the location of professional English football clubs in this between 1947 and 1966. And the areas are the historic counties of England. And anyone who's tried to do research on regional data for the UK going back before the 1970s will have hit the same problem that I did, which is that reorganization of local government in the 1970s completely rewrote this map. So that's why these are called the historic counties, and data on these really only goes up to the late 60s. But interestingly, most of the historic counties had a soccer club, at least one. So if we think about the impact on TV on sport, so essentially, I think the fundamental point is that TV is a substitute leisure activity to going to a sports event. So it's likely to have a negative impact on attendance in some ways by eating into your hours for leisure. Before television, you have more time, or you have fewer activities to which to devote your leisure, and therefore the advent of TV makes attending sporting events in general compete for your time. But also, obviously, TV represented an opportunity to enlarge viewership exponentially. It's a huge increase in the potential reach of any game by when it can be televised. But also, of course, that in turn threatens to create competition among the sporting events which could be scheduled at the same time. So I want to say something first about the status of baseball and English football at the time, and particularly for baseball. I want to stress that in the period we're discussing, baseball is America's national sport, is the national game. These two quotes from the 1950s emphasize the centrality, the cultural centrality of baseball. And of course, this is no longer true, right? We no longer think of baseball as being the national sport. Well, some people might argue it still is, but in some sense, football, American football, has, in the eyes of many, taken its place. And that process really did start in the 1950s, but even by 1960, professional American football is still way behind baseball. So you can see here attendance in 1960, pro baseball, 28 million. It was the first season of the AFL, which would ultimately emerge with the NFL to create the modern structure with the Super Bowl and all that. This is pre-Super Bowl, and only 4 million people were going. College football, was much bigger. College football did, to some extent, rival baseball in terms of attendance levels, although bear in mind, there is limited overlap in the season between baseball and college football. Now, likewise, English football, this is less, I probably need to spend less time persuading you of this, but English football was completely dominant in the social landscape of Britain in the 1950s, as it still is today. And you can see here, notice that cricket was then still tiny and is still tiny relative to football. But notice these other things, greyhound racing, 50 million people going to greyhound racing in England in the 1950s. And that's partly because it was an opportunity to gamble at a time when gambling was limited. When the opportunity to gamble legally on football matches emerged, greyhound racing declined significantly. This quote is from a report published in 1951. So I want to say a few words about the history of professional baseball leading up to the period in which we're talking about. So baseball is a venerable sport. The National League, which is one half of Major League Baseball, was founded in 1876. That has been defined as the first major league, and historians will say that by a year later, minor leagues were being established. So the major minor league distinction develops very early on. And to a large extent, this had to do with control of the labor market. The National League adopted the Reserve Clause in 1879. In 1883, there's a tripartite agreement to respect both exclusive territories and player contracts between major and minor leagues. In 1901, the American League becomes the second major league. There are now two leagues with 8 teams in each. And in the same year, the National Association of Professional Baseball Leagues is found, which is basically the association for the minor leagues. And in 1903, there's a National Baseball Commission founded to oversee pro baseball in general. So administrative structures are established by the beginning of the 20th century, governing the structures of baseball. And between 1903 and the period that we're focusing on in the 1950s, very little happens apart from the emergence of the farm system. And we'll talk about the farm system a little bit more in a moment. But essentially, the antitrust exemption grant in 1922 just helped to solidify the system that had already been established. Now, in the 1950s, sorry, yep. Was there a question? Hello?
My mistake. Sorry, Stephen.
Oh, okay. So in the 1950s, we start to see changes in Major League Baseball. The first relocation in 1953, and in 1961, the first expansion with 2 teams. So let me say a little bit more about the league structures. So typically, minor league baseball was operated on a structure similar to the major leagues, and in other words, that a league would typically consist of 8 teams, although sometimes 6, or it could be a different number, but 8 was the focus for most organizations. And the teams were classified according to the population of the combined population of the towns and cities in which the teams operated. So you would be located, designated AAA if the population of your area, of your teams added up to 3 million or more, AA, 1 3/4 million, single A, 1 million, way down to D, C, D, and E with just 150,000. So these classifications obviously the teams, leagues could change, but this provided a fairly rigid structure within which teams operated. Note that these classifications were Simon Rothenberg's famous article in '56 talks a lot about the minor league economics as well as the major leagues. By the mid-1950s, about 1/4 of the minor league teams are actually outright owned by a major league team. And about half of them had what were called working agreements. A working agreement involved a subsidy from the major league team in exchange for rights to acquire players. So this is essentially the culmination of the farm system, where the major leagues effectively have some economic control over the activities of minor league teams. And by this time, by the mid-50s, only about 1/4 of all the teams of minor league teams were actually independent of a major league team, but still usually dependent on them in one way or another in order to generate revenue by trading players. This was all underpinned by the reserve system, which limited the earning potential of the players. So there's limited information on the actual economics of individual minor league teams, but this is my attempt to sort of put together some kind of rough idea of what was going on. So I have attendance data, and that comes from this website StatsCrew, where has all the minor leagues going back to the 1880s, and has attendance, pretty thorough attendance data, particularly in the period we're talking about, the 1950s. If we assume that, so these are the this would be the average attendance at teams in each category over the season. If the average ticket price at this time of Major League Baseball was about $1.60, if we think this is 1952. So if we assume that the ticket prices would be roughly half that in the minor leagues, but that they'd also generate some revenue from concessions as well. So if we assume that a revenue would generate would roughly be about $1 per ticket sold, then, and if we use Rottenberg's data on the monthly wages paid at each level to extrapolate to figure out what the wage bill was based on the roster size, which was varied between 25 at the top level down to 16 at the D level with a 5-month season, I can reach an estimate that, roughly speaking, about half of the revenue of the clubs would have gone on wages back in 1952. So this, in that sense, these were economically viable teams on average. Obviously, there were huge variations, but on average, they would be economically viable. It's also important to bear in mind that the minor leagues are regional, and the distances traveled are relatively small. At the AAA level, which is close to major league level, you do have quite long distances on average between the teams. But as you go down the list for AAA, AA, single A, B, C, D, you can see that the average distance between the teams diminishes quite dramatically. So that the D level, the Appalachian League, the average difference was just 64 miles, which is what, at worst, a couple of hours drive. So in that sense, travel distances were not that great, and not in general, not that much greater on average than you would see in England at the same time. So let me say something about the development of league football in England and Wales. Again, many of you will know much of this stuff. The football leagues founded in 1888, second divisions added with promotion and relegation in 1892. The retain and transfer system, which has a lot in common with the reserve clause, is established in the 1890s, early 1900s. The expansion continues. So by World War I, you have 40 teams operating in 2 divisions. 1901, the Football League establishes a maximum wage rule. Unlike baseball, professional football in England was suspended for both of the world wars. Football was continued to be played, but they were exhibition games, really essentially run by the government. After the First World War, there's a significant expansion of the Football League to create 4 equally sized divisions of 88 teams. The third tier being organized on a regional basis, divided between the North and the South. And that structure really, in many ways, is the same structure that exists today. Basically, there's not that much difference between the structure in 1923 and the structure in 2025. In 1950, the Football League was expanded to 92 teams, and in 1958, the regional tiers became national as the third and fourth division. So again, the organizational structure here is described. All the clubs were organized, well, actually, except one, Nottingham Forest was the exception, but all the clubs were organized as limited liability companies, with that exception, and generally had a very dispersed shareholding. So many of the clubs, when they were founded, it was sort of middle class, upper middle class fans that bought the shares, and there were many, so there could be indeed often thousands of shareholders in these companies. Very few with just one single owner. And the FA had imposed rules which limited the economic exploitation of football clubs. There was a prohibition on company directors being salaried, and there was a maximum dividend imposed, which was equal to 7.5% of the issue shared capital, which, given inflation and given the shared capital was generally issued at around 1900, by the 1950s, these dividends were to a significant extent meaningless. There was a maximum wage imposed on the players, a maximum earnings of £12 a week, which rose to £20 by 1960, at which point the maximum wage was abolished. And clubs were tied to their players were tied to their club by the retained transfer system. So if we look at the economics of the English Football League, what you can see here is, now here we have much better information than we have for the US. We can get the financial statements for the clubs from Companies House, the audited financial statements. I have the data from 1948, well, actually from 1947 up until the present day. But here I'm looking at this period 48 to 66 and have 81% of all league clubs' annual financial statements. So a very high level of coverage. And if we try to sort of make a comparison of the wage levels, the maximum wage was equivalent, with today would be equivalent to about £400 a week or $540. And if you compare that to what a single A player in minor league baseball was making in 1952, that amounted to about £900 or $1,200. So the salaries in minor league baseball were probably around double the salaries in English football. Although bear in mind that there was a lot of fiddling going on in English football, a lot of under-the-counter payments being made to players in order to evade, to good players, in order to evade the restrictions. Let me make a few comparisons here in the era before the advent of television. So actually, if we look on the tables, the charts on the right first, you can see that that's the top right-hand corner is the attendance at Major League Baseball and the English First Division. And what's very striking here is how correlated they are. So the correlation coefficient is 0.92 for attendance, annual attendance, which the big differences are the interruptions due to the world wars, and also the Great Depression, which had a much bigger negative impact on attendance at Major League Baseball than English First Division football, although it did affect English First Division football, not fundamentally so much. The bottom right-hand corner shows the number of teams at all levels, so professional baseball at all levels and professional football at all levels compared to the US and the UK. And what you can see here is before World War I, actually there are many more baseball teams per capita in the United States than there are football teams per capita in England and Wales. But after the First World War, that changes and there's a rough parity in teams per capita. Although again, the Great Depression has a big negative impact on the US. But what you can see on the left-hand corner is that's an image of the total number of teams. And what you can see is on average, there were many more pro baseball teams than there were professional football teams, but there's an enormous amount of variance. So you can see these huge spikes. There's a big negative spike for the First World War in the United States. There's the big negative spike for the Great Depression. There's also a huge drop-off just at the end there in baseball during the Second World War. So here finally we get to the post-war attendance crisis that I'm focusing on, and here you can see the decline in attendance in the minor leagues and the decline in attendance at the English Football League. So at all levels, and in both cases, there are significant declines in attendance. And this followed from actually a big jump just after the war. So just after the war is as soldiers, traditional story is told, soldiers coming back from the front, the end of austerity, people having more freedom to do what they want. There's this huge demand for leisure activities, and baseball in the US and football in England are two of the biggest opportunities, to the main leisure attractions. And so you get this huge spike. But then in both cases, from late 1940s, early 1950s, you get this very significant, consistent decline in attendances. And the pattern on both cases is the same. And this phenomenon was very much noticed at the time. So there was a lot said at the time about the reasons for this decline. The House of Representatives in the US had many hearings which talked about this. Here is just some. Television was widely blamed. Television made substantial inroads on consumer demand. Attendance have fallen, and this is in 1952. The second comment I think is important. I would say, I might be getting off the line, but television hurts not only when the baseball game is televised, it is general television. It is not only baseball that hurts on TV, it's every show on TV that hurts. And I think that's really important. The extent to which individual broadcasts of baseball games might have affected attendance is a difficult question to analyze. But it's not hard to see that television was taking up a lot of people's time. By the end of the 1950s, average household spending about 5.5 hours a day on TV. That significantly cut into leisure opportunities, leisure alternatives, of which going to a baseball game would obviously be one. And there's been a fair consensus amongst historians that TV was a major factor in the collapse of minor leagues and the decline in attendance. Not only, there's some say that other factors could have played a bigger role. David Surdam noticeably, with a paper in JSE in 2005, says that the best overall explanation of the decline in major leagues between 1949 and 1993 is overexpansion into smaller towns that proved unable to sustain minor league teams. Well, I think in some sense that's sort of begging the question. The question is, why is it that they collapsed? Why was it overexpansion? What were the economic factors that determined the fact that smaller towns could not sustain a minor league team? Now, in Britain, there were also serious discussions about the declining attendance at English football and the causes and consequences. And so the government organized a report in 1968, which firmly identified television as a major competitor for people's leisure time. But again, that was not the only factor. This interesting observation: every 1% fall in league attendances, there's 1% fall in league attendances for every 1% rise in consumers' expenditure. And other factors like car ownership expanding leisure opportunities. However, that said, when you look at the data, the correlation between TV's share of households and attendance at baseball and football is pretty consistent. The charts, because I've adopted a common scale, they don't show the downward slopes are not dramatic, but they are all downward slopes except for the major league. And I put the correlation coefficients on the left so that you can see that outside of Major League Baseball, where there appears to have been no correlation between TV penetration and attendance, in every other case, in England and in the United States, you see significant negative correlation between attendance and TV penetration. And indeed, if anything, the correlations are stronger in England than they are in the US. Here's a chart which repeats the one that I just showed you, but I think is a nice one because it just illustrates it very neatly. Divisions 1, 2, and then 3 and 4 combined. this is the correlation between the share of households with TV license and the log of attendance. It's pretty linear and negative across all three levels of game. Now, if you, some of you, I think, may have been at Dennis's conference in Baltimore back in the spring, and I presented a version, an earlier version of this paper, which focused really entirely on minor league baseball. And for that, I used some more detailed data on TV penetration, not just the share of TV households, but data on coverage by TV stations and the total number of TV stations. And what I found in that, controlling for a wide range of other factors, including population, family incomes, car ownership, with league dummies, counting season fixed effects, I found a negative effect of television penetration on attendance at minor league baseball. Here is the sort of similar kind of regression for English football. Again, looking at the share of TV, and I've highlighted here in red the impact of TV's share. The first specification is just an OLS regression. The second includes season fixed effects. The third includes club and season fixed effects. And in the fourth, I just omitted TV just to see whether that suddenly made something else significant. And what you can see here is the coefficient on TV share is pretty consistent and negative. I have data on broadcast football. So live games were not broadcast until the 1980s, live league games. There were live internationals and FA Cup games, but there were no live league games. But there were highlights broadcast of league football from the 1950s onwards. And I looked at the number of, and I got data on the number of games shown and found, and they've used that as to, and there was some regional variation in the number of games shown by, and so I used that to try and see whether broadcast football had any effect, and I couldn't find any effect. If you notice underneath the TV shares, I've got the vehicles, the log of vehicle ownership. Remember, this is all, the TV share and is all by county. The income is by county and vehicles are by county. If you're interested, I'll tell you the story of how I put together the vehicle data, which is people in its own right, to be honest. But you can see here that whilst the vehicle ownership is significant in the first column, it really doesn't appear to be very important. Even when you leave out TV share, it really doesn't become significant. Likewise, incomes don't seem to be that important. They're significant in the first two columns, but when you add season fixed effects, the income variable disappears, which is essentially some kind of a time trend, really, I think. Okay, so so in that sense, we see a very similar effect in the US and the UK. But what I do now is I'm actually going to combine the US and the UK into one regression to jointly estimate the impact of TV. Because for both the US and the UK, I know the TV share for by county level, and I know the win percentage. And notice win percentage is very significant for both baseball and English football. And so then I use that to estimate a single coefficient for TV share across the US and the UK, and then allow interaction terms to see whether there are significant differences. So that's what this equation shows. And although the TV share coefficient is slightly different for the US and England, when you look at the differences, when you look at the interaction terms, you don't, for almost all cases, you don't see much of a difference. The one real difference is in the major leagues, where TV does not have a negative impact. And we saw that where there was no correlation between Major League Baseball and TV share of households. But otherwise, there's very little difference between the leagues. So in some senses, I want to argue that this was a common shock to both systems that had broadly similar effects. And so if I use the regression from the first column, where I combine England, and then I compare the actual attendance with the fitted values based on the regression, here's what I get. And I think this is quite striking. What you can see here is this is essentially the red dots are baseball, the blue dots are English football. At the bottom, you can see that's all the minor leagues. At the top, that's Major League Baseball. And then sandwiched in between them is the English football clubs. And what you can see is these are all pretty much aligned on a 45-degree line. So there do not appear to be significant biases. There's a handful of outliers at the bottom end, maybe 20 or so observations which are significant outliers. But apart from that, across these several thousand observations, we seem to have a common pattern. And that's the sort of key part of my argument, is that effectively television had broadly the same effect on baseball as it did on English football. But here's the big difference. In the English, there's the number of teams in the English Football League, which is that flat blue line. It basically didn't change. Whereas what you can see in baseball is this enormous expansion in the number of teams after the Second World War, and then there's almost equally precipitous collapse from 1950 onwards. And here is a map, just to illustrate this a bit more. Here's a map of the location of all counties that had a minor league team between 1944 and 1961. And here are maps showing the distributions in 1944, 1948, 1955, and 1961. So what you can see is in 1944, still wartime, and there are relatively few minor league teams. By 1948, it's like chickenpox, right? It's that suddenly everybody has a minor league team. Every population has a minor league team. By 1955, it's thinned out quite a lot. And by 1961, the patient is well on the way to recovery. The dots are almost entirely disappeared. Well, there's still quite a few, but still significantly fewer than in 1961.
Stefan?
Yeah.
Steve has got his hand up with a question.
Yeah, Steve.
This may not detract from your thesis, but the comparison, and if you go back 2 slides to the decline in that one. So the U.S. Pro Baseball basically ends up where the English Football League was. But I wonder if the better comparison is not the English Football League, but all of English football. And you may get the results may be the same, but one way to tell this story was that there's some weird basis of U.S. hyperinflation in clubs that then came back to a norm for the country. But this ignores divisions 5 through whatever in the English football story, which is a big part, especially with promotional relegation, of the English football story that sort of never existed in the United States. Now, I don't know if that changes your analysis at all, but one way that an American would look at this is to say the English Football League are 4 divisions. And by 1966, we basically have 5 divisions in U.S. sport. So it's basically the same. And what was anomalous was the weird post-war increase in U.S. firms. But I think if you would compare it to the significantly larger number of total teams in the FA, then you would see a story more consistent with what you're talking about how radically different U.S. baseball is, where I would say English football went from 1966 to having God knows how many clubs at 10 levels to the U.S. system where it closed up to 4 levels. And that to me is an even greater contrast.
Yeah, well, so I'd say two things about that, Steve. So firstly, as I was careful about this, it says the number of professional teams. The 4 English divisions are professional football in England, and anything below that in the 1950s is not professional. And likewise, this is pro baseball. So of course, actually, you have a lot more amateur baseball and a lot more amateur football in England, and I'm not really looking at that. I'm looking at the professional leagues.
And then
And
just to
secondly,
clarify, was there still promotion?
Sorry,
Was
Steve.
from amateur to professional at the did the winner of the 5th tier still get promoted and become professional in English?
No,
okay.
Steve, no, they didn't.
I got it.
And also bear in mind that what we're talking, there's 2 things you have to bear in mind here. It's not just that there's this large expansion in the number of teams in minor league baseball. It's also that you have the same pattern of attendance. And that it's the 2 things together that you have to explain. So yes, you could say, oh, it's just an exceptional thing about the US, but in fact, the pattern of attendance is the same between the 2. So in that sense, it's why is there this difference? Okay, let me go back. Yeah, so just to emphasize the point, up until the 1980s, below teams that come bottom of the 4th level had to apply to be re-elected, and other clubs could apply to be elected to the Football League. In almost all cases, teams got re-elected that were already in the league, and this was a great source of frustration to teams outside the league. It was almost impossible to get in, and I'll mention a couple of cases where they did, but by and large it couldn't happen. Okay, so one thing I've looked at here is looking at the attendance in minor league baseball. How much of the attendance decline could be attributed to the closure of teams, the fact that a team ended, rather than between season declines of teams that continue to exist. And essentially, something like nearly half of the declining attendance was actually due to the closure of teams, right? So attendance was declining at minor league baseball even without closures, but closures really expanded that decline significantly. So the next thing I did here was to look at the exit probability for a minor league team as a function of attendance, win percentage, and TV share. And what you can see here is there's 2 regressions, a logit and an OLS regression, which shows that actually attendance and TV share are 2 of the 2 biggest factors. And it's not really hard to see why this is, right? So certainly attendance, when attendance collapses, there's an incentive to close down the team altogether. Probably the win percentage is insignificant because it's actually highly correlated with the attendance. So and we saw that in the early attendance regressions, when attendance declines dramatically when win percentage goes down. But also the TV share has a significant impact on the probability of exit. So as TV share grows, it's more likely that teams will exit the league. I put in a dummy for the 45 to 48 seasons just because that was the period of expansion okay, so that's where I estimate what I call the fold probability. So we have the coefficients for attendance, win percentage, TV share for the minor league regression. So we can apply those coefficients to the data for the English football clubs, where we also have attendance, win percentage, and TV share, and then use that to generate a probability in each season that the club would fold.
Stefan?
Yeah.
Dennis has got a question.
Oh.
Hey, Stefan, could you go back a slide?
Yeah.
So the way reading this and the way I think you've explained it is that the dependent variable takes a 1 if a team leaves, if a team folds, and 0 otherwise. And if that's the case, this is saying, to my understanding, that a higher TV share now I've got myself confused. It seems to me like the sign is wrong, the way you described it. So maybe say it again and I won't be so thick and I'll understand.
Oh yeah, no, that's sorry. The regression is, what is the probability that this is the last season or that the team is playing minor league baseball? So if it's the last, so the probability that it's the last season is higher when attendance is lower.
Thank you.
Okay. So if I go back to this fold probability, so this generates a probability in each season that that the team would fold. And then if we want to know over the entire period, what is the probability that you would not have folded over the entire period 1947 to 1966? It's 1 minus the product of the individual season fold probabilities. So I calculate these, and it turns out that these are pretty intuitive. So you've probably all heard of Tottenham. So Tottenham had a 96% probability of not folding in this period, which sounds about right. They were a pretty solvent club. The chances of them going bust were pretty small. Southport, you may not have heard of unless you're really into the history of English football. They had a 36% probability of not folding. In other words, they had a 2/3 probability of folding based on the minor league data, which Southport was a low tier club with significant financial difficulties over the period. And we can look at these, we can look at the fold probabilities or the not fold probabilities and relate them to the economic data that we get from the financial statements. First, here is, those are the not fold probabilities for all of the clubs. So the average not fold probability was 76%. So mostly the clubs were not expected to fold. But what's the probability that you would have 0 or 1 club fold over this entire period? Well, from the binomial theorem, binomial probability, you can work that out. It's essentially 0. What's the probability that 10 or fewer clubs would fold? It was only 0.1, 0.2%. The probability that 21 or fewer clubs would fold was 50%. In other words, if the fold probability for the English clubs, the likelihood that you would go through this era with 0 or 1 clubs folding was very, very low, based on the minor league baseball data. If the English clubs were subject to the same economic conditions as the minor league teams, you would have seen many more teams fold. In fact, were there any clubs that folded in this period? Well, there were 3 clubs that left the English Football League. That's New Brighton, Gateshead, and Accrington Stanley. They all folded eventually, but actually only Accrington Stanley folded in our period, and they folded in 1966, 5 years after they'd left the English Football League. All 3 of them were subsequently refounded, and all except New Brighton are still playing football today. So in other words, the incidence of folding was far, far lower in English football. But the fold probabilities for the clubs were closely correlated with their economic success. So higher fold probabilities were associated with less successful and economically weaker clubs. So in the top right-hand corner, you can see the league rank and the fold probability. Remember, the higher the league rank, the lower down the system you are. All the clubs, the top 5 clubs, with the lowest fold probability were Tottenham, Manchester United, Liverpool, Everton, and Arsenal, which was, basically 5 of the dominant clubs in English football at the time, and to some extent still. Whereas the teams down at the bottom end were much more likely to fold. If you take the ratio of wages to revenues, teams with high wage to revenue ratios had much higher probabilities of folding than teams with low wage revenue ratios. And if you take the ratio of profits to revenues, teams with negative profitability were more likely to, or would have a higher fold probability than teams with positive profit ratios. So in other sense, the fold probabilities are capturing the economic weakness of the teams. It's just that they didn't fold. So one reason why they didn't fold was supporter clubs. And this is from the 1966 PEP report. In the mid-60s, the donations by supporter clubs to the teams represented something like 17% of total revenue for the Football League clubs, which is really quite staggering when you think about it. And I picked an example here. This is the financial statement for Newport County, again, another small club in Wales that played in the English Football League. Their financial statements from 1957-58. I've highlighted in red, on the left is the expenditure, £29,403. And on the right is the revenue, £23,839. So a very significant deficit of about maybe £5,500. The fold probability for Newport County was nearly 50% over this period. What kept them afloat? Well, you can see here, particularly in 1958, they received a donation of £9,000 from the supporter club. Basically, the supporters got together and gave the club £9,000, which turned a £5,500 deficit into a £6,500 surplus. And that's how a lot of the clubs were surviving. So why did the miners fold when the English Football League didn't? So my argument is institutions. And I want to consider briefly some confounders as well. But I just want to mention a couple of anecdotes here before we get to that. There was a lot of churn in the minor leagues. So one interesting, there's Reading, Pennsylvania has long had a team, and between 1961 and 1965, the minor league team left town 3 times, came back 3 times as well. But that's the kind of level of churn that existed. Take an example of just a team that survived for 1 season, the Roseville Diamonds in Roseville, California. They played for 1 season. At the end of the season, the owner sold the team to someone in Santa Rosa, California, another town. And before people talk about community and the significance of community involvement, there were community baseball teams. So in 1957, the St. Louis Cardinals sold the Rochester minor league team to Rochester Community Baseball Incorporated, which had 8,200 local investors. But the other thing I want to stress is the league instability. So here's a Class B league, the Illinois, Iowa, Indiana League, between 1947 and 1961. And you can see most seasons it has the sort of 8-team complement that 8, sometimes 9, sometimes 10, sometimes 8, 7, 6. But what you can see is that they're shifting between counties. There is no county that had a minor league team in every season. These teams are jumping around, arguably looking for profits by moving the teams to different towns. And that's part of the fundamental instability of the league. So to repeat the argument I used at the beginning, it's the institutions, the rules of the game that determine what happens and that are likely to determine long-term economic outcomes. In England, we have a collective governance structure under the Football Association and the promotion and relegation system that creates an incentive to preserve a team in the face of economic losses. If your team is unsuccessful this year, well, you could always come back and be promoted and be successful in future years, which is not just a theoretical possibility, but actually a real possibility. Whereas the closed American system created monopoly power at the top, which was exacerbated by television. So let me just briefly talk about some possible confounders. Is it the microeconomics? Could it be the team economics? Well, they're very similar. Basically, the players and the stadium are the only two inputs here. The only real source of revenue is ticket sales in this era. And so in that sense, the economics look very similar. And an important point in mind, sports teams are fundamentally scalable. A team is viable at any size. You just play worse, play a worse game, but you can actually do it if you want to. You may not want to, but you can do it. Of course, we also had this sort of standard argument about win maximizers versus profit maximizers. The English clubs were organized as for-profit organizations. They had constraints over their ability to distribute profits. Even if they were win maximizers, they were losing substantial amounts of money. Win maximization makes sense subject to a budget constraint and break even. But what happens when you don't break even? Well, even for a win maximizer, the logic is that you would close. That didn't happen. Could it be macroeconomics? The post-war US economy is far stronger than the UK. The standard of living is rising faster. Does that mean there were better substitution opportunities in the US? Well, that's a harder one to say. Obviously, there are differences, but basically bear in mind when Germany became an affluent country in the 70s, more affluent than the UK, its football clubs didn't fold either. It wasn't that the affluence somehow or the better substitution opportunities led to the decline of collapse of football clubs. Is it culture? Well, declining popularity of baseball, I would argue that hadn't really set in seriously in the 50s, and it was only really in the 60s that really took a hit. Were Americans less committed to local teams, more mobile population, limiting the opportunity to create a fan base, absence of local boosters? Well, there were local boosters. There's lots of evidence that local people were trying to keep the teams alive. Are Americans less committed to their teams? Well, I think the counterexample here is college sports. Throughout this era, college sports are doing just fine, and programs are not shutting down. Football programs are not shutting down. Go to the big house any fall in Ann Arbor, and you'll see plenty of commitment to a local team. So I don't think that really works. So again, to summarize my argument, that the advent of TV represented a common exogenous shock to the pro-sports landscape, and that the institutions of governance can explain why the minor league clubs folded, and the English football clubs didn't, when faced with almost exactly the same pressures in terms of attendance decline. And what I go on further to say is that this represents a very nice example because the rollout of TV happens at the same time across the two countries. But TV eventually came to everywhere in Europe and indeed everywhere across the world. And the experience of the UK has been repeated everywhere. Football clubs across Europe have not disappeared as a result of television. in the way that the minor league teams did. Okay, I shall leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Stefan. I'm giving you a team's round of applause. And Steve very eagerly has already got his hand up. So Steve, go ahead.
So as some of you may know, I'm an acolyte, and Stefan and I, in fact, wrote a book about promotion and relegation. So obviously the second bullet point there is highly persuasive to me. Stefan, really interesting, but I would offer a complementary explanation that that you don't discuss, and I'm just curious as to why, which is the growth of farm teams, or what IO economists would call the vertical integration of player development in American baseball compared to English football. And one of the factors I think that affected the institutional choice was and I don't know why this is, but that Major League Baseball evolved, and you're familiar with the story, into a system of a farm system. So independent teams were costly, of lesser value, and in some cases seen as a possible competitive threat to Major League Baseball because of the opportunity to provide an independent source of players to a potential third major league. Whereas in England, at the same time, for whatever reason, clubs didn't use that system. And I could offer a interesting counter history, especially with some of your other work involving the ways in which the Football League captures the FA, that if for whatever other reason the top teams in English football had become a system of farm teams, they might have been more keen to take steps to get rid of lower tier teams and enhance the exit of lower teams, because once again, they would be advantaged, and especially given promotion and relegation, the likelihood that Aston Villa could become a top team to challenge the other top teams by buying players from smaller teams would be minimized if there were fewer smaller teams because of the farm system that operated. So I'm curious as to why the farm system story isn't part of the story of the demise of American teams, because my sense is they were not only did they leave because they didn't have promotion and relegation as a goal and because of our profit maximum, all the reasons you said, but they also left because they were sort of squeezed out because Major League Baseball wanted a system that they now have of complete vertical integration.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and the farm system is an important part of this story, right? And you go back to institutions, and essentially the monopolization of baseball by the major leagues is a key part of that story. And I did mention that, you know, by the mid 1950s, essentially 3/4 of minor league teams are essentially under the control of major league teams. So in that sense, the decision to close down these teams was actually a decision of the major leagues, because they had this control. So yeah, I think that's all part of it. So the lack of independence of that the farm system created was a key part of it. It's also, I mean, I didn't have time to say it. I mean, one of the things was that the major leagues complained that they were losing money from the farm teams in the late 50s, and that was why they were unable to support them any longer. But at the same time, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, when minor league baseball was expanding, it was widely believed that major league teams were profiting significantly from minor league baseball, that they were actually taking money out of the minor leagues in the process. So yeah, I think it's definitely part of the story. I maybe didn't articulate it as well as I should have, but I think it's part of the story of institutions, and I think yeah. So I agree with your point.
Great, thanks, Steve. Roger's next.
That was extremely interesting, Stefan. I'd offer a couple of observations followed by a question, if I may. Anecdotally, having read a great number of the football programmes of that era, the problem with television, particularly highlighted there, was the Saturday afternoon multi-sports programmes like Grandstand and its ITV equivalent. So it wasn't so much football as rugby league and horse racing and so on that were drawing people away. And there was a particular fall in the English attendances around 1960-61 when both of those programmes really got going. The second observation, when you talked about the number of English professional clubs pre-First World War, you limited yourself there to the Football League clubs, where, as James knows, I'm a very strong advocate of the quality of professionalism in the Southern League before the First World War. And I think it would be worth adding that number of clubs into your data there. Or another way of looking at it is the number of professional players that existed. And I have seen a quote of 7,000 professionals in the UK sometime before the First World War. I suspect they weren't all full time. To come to my question, I wonder to what extent 1947 was an anomaly in UK sports. It certainly was the highest point, or thereabouts, of English Football League attendances, but it also saw massive attendances at Speedway and Greyhounds, two other working class sports. And I wonder what effect it would have on your story if you were to go back to the attendance data in the English Football Leagues from, say, 1930. Thank you.
Thanks, Roger. So on your 2 points, I totally agree on both of them. And your first point, I think the important point is it's not baseball on TV, it's not football on TV that had the major effect. It's TV taking up your leisure time and whatever you're watching. And if you're watching sports on a Saturday afternoon, that's a big thing to take away. But then there's if you're watching a television drama on a Wednesday evening when you needed to do something else, maybe that then eats into your Saturday afternoon as well. You know, I think that substitution effect is going to be pretty significant. I felt very guilty about the Southern League. I was thinking about it, and as I was writing my notes, and you're quite right to pull me up on it. I don't. In the end, I don't think it makes a little bit of a difference of how you compare pre-World War I sport in the baseball with English football, but otherwise, I don't think it's going to make much of a difference to the overall story. Certainly not by the 1950s, where you know, in the TV. As for the impact of as for the 1947 story, I mean, this is ultimately the core question in all of this is to what extent do you attribute what happened in the 1950s to television? It's very clearly the two things, the penetration of TV and the decline of attendance at baseball and football are clearly very, very highly correlated. But is that causal? And I don't. In the end, I don't know I'm ever going to be able to answer that satisfactorily. In my baseball paper that I gave earlier this year, I concluded that it was based on a battery of tests that I applied and I thought were persuasive. But in one of these things, of course, we don't have controlled experiments. So of course, we're never really going to know for sure. So I think there was no TV to speak of in the 30s, and so clearly TV couldn't have had any effect on that. You're right. 47, is exceptional. It's exceptional in the US and in the UK. But the extent to which you believe in the causal effect of TV on attendance, I think that's the central question you have to decide yourself. I'm persuaded that it was, but I can understand that not everyone is necessarily persuaded.
Great. Thanks, Roger. Next is Dennis.
Thanks, Stefan. I love the way you've gone with this paper since I saw the baseball version last spring. But I do have a couple of questions or comments, and they aren't about the attendance so much as the existence of clubs. And so I'd really like, and this is a little bit similar to what Roger said, that I'd really like to see what the number of minor league clubs was pre-war. And the reason I wonder about that is, and maybe I have this completely wrong, but my impression is that millions of American GIs returned home in 1946. And at the same time, you've got this burst of these minor league clubs where, the guys that had been in the rural areas are coming home. They've spent a bunch of time, and now they're reincorporating into the community. And one way they're doing that is by doing sports, particularly baseball, which was the big thing at the time. And as they're more and more integrated into the society, those clubs disappear. So I'd really be interested to see if something along.
See my screen? Can you still see my screen, Dave?
Yeah.
Can you see the chart on the left-hand side? That's the number of teams before the World War II.
Oh, I did not see this screen. I'm sorry, I was out of the room for a few minutes.
Sorry.
Um,
Can I make it bigger?
Unless you want to look up my nostril or something, that probably would be a good idea.
I was enjoying that. That was was like see the world from every possible angle. It gives you a sense of what's really happening. Yeah, let's see.
Yeah.
Is that better?
Much.
So what you can see here is that you've got this got a boom bust story with minor league baseball that before World War One you've got this huge boom, then you've got a bust in World War One, then you've got a boom again after World War One, and then a bust in the Great Depression, then a boom as the US is coming out of the Great Depression, and then again a bust in World War Two. So what you see is this sort of highly cyclical process for baseball, which is something to do with demand. I mean, this is tracking demand levels, but I don't think that I don't think there's a fundamentally different social story behind this. I mean, the same kinds of boom and bust and demand were happening in England in different ways, right? In UK had a Great Depression. There was, had two world wars as well. I think the same kind of processes. It's just, I don't think you can explain this unless you turn to the institutions which underpinned it. So in other sense, arguing the economics of Britain and the United States are roughly similar. And so that can't explain this striking difference in the pattern. Whereas institutions are strikingly different and so can explain this pattern.
Okay. Now, so my second question was related to the teams that are disappearing. So there was a lot of talk about the independent teams and the teams affiliated with major league clubs. Did you present, and I just missed it again, the split between those? Because my impression was a lot of them would have been the independent clubs that disappeared.
No, I didn't show the split, and that's something I should do. But bear in mind that essentially in 1949 we have 450 minor league teams. In 1960 we have about 130. So independent or not independent, they're all disappearing. They're all vanishing. I mean, probably, yes, disproportionately independents are disappearing. Yes, that's true, I think, although I didn't show that data. But nonetheless, the major league affiliates are also disappearing as well, because they're just withdrawing their support. They're saying we're not prepared to subsidize it.
And that connects to my final point, but also makes me wonder. I'm not 100% certain on how this changed, but the independent clubs were very much in the business of selling players, whereas the non-independent clubs were not so much. And I wonder if something else might have happened at that time. The development of the minor league systems, certainly had something to, the affiliation with the major league clubs certainly had something to do with that. But if it would have made for even faster decline among the independents if you were not able to sell players to the major leagues any longer. And then my last point is, if a question or a comment is, you had that great 4-figure diagram where you had the country divided, the maps of the country with the dots for where the minor league clubs are. And you talked about the importance of college athletics towards the end. And it reminds me of a question that Greg Depkin asked me recently, which was Saturday football or Sunday football? And my answer was Sunday football, because I grew up in New York and we had professional football teams. He grew up in Georgia. They did not have professional football teams. And so I wonder if there's a regional element to how quickly they disappear. And if it's to whether you have a major league club or just associated with college.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. I mean, both great points. I mean, in terms of the contractual structure, and as you're rightly saying that the independents were reliant on trading players to the majors. There were changes. It was a constant fight. There were frequent revisions. But my understanding is there was nothing earth-shattering that happened in the 1950s which you can associate with the collapse of major leagues. And as I say, the collapse occurred across the board. I mean, it was not just independents, not affiliates, not fully owned. It was just the whole lot of them were vanishing. On the regional affiliation, I mean, for me, I think it's an important argument that somehow Americans are not interested in, are not committed enough to support a local team in the way that the British and the Europeans are prepared to support their local football team. I think that's baloney. I think college sport demonstrates very clearly that people have strong local affiliations to sports teams and that they survived. And indeed, if you could rewrite this paper, I think, with instead of substitute college football for minor league baseball, and you get roughly the same story. It's different structure. The institutional structure there is about the university being prepared to subsidize the team at a loss, and of course not paying for the players, having free players as well as part of that story. But I think you get that parallel there. So yeah, I think, but I do think the difficulty in drawing statistical differences is that you've got the one thing that will preserve a minor league team is a strong economic base, and you'll tend to have that around the bigger cities. So on the one hand, in the big cities, you may not have the regional loyalty, but on the other hand, you will have stronger economic power. So those two can offset each other. I think is a problem.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Dennis. And then Pete next.
Oh, you're
me, Pete.
I think I'm on now. I really enjoyed the story and how a substitute can affect attendance. The one thing that kind of curious, because in the United States, particularly early on, there was a Negro or a African-American league. How did you, I didn't know if that really affected the number of minor league teams after its demise, or how you dealt with that sort of information in your analysis.
No, that's a really great question, and it's something that's sort of fascinates me, and I haven't actually done the analysis yet. So there is a book came out last year, which is, or this year actually, which is a list of all black players who played in the minor leagues, and I need to contact the authors to see if they'll give me a digital version of this, so that I can then see what the difference was, what effect the integration it had on the attendance and folding of minor league baseball teams. And my hypothesis is that it had a negative effect, that there were plenty of people who didn't want to go see minor league baseball anymore because it's full of black players now, and I don't like them, and that's an end of it. So that's a paper I want to write, but I haven't collected the data yet to do it. But I think it's a great question, and I think it's an important one, again, for understanding, you know, how integration worked and what the consequences are. We're too full of the, oh, Jackie Robinson, wasn't it all wonderful? And there was very much a dark underbelly to that whole story, I think.
Yes, that's very true. That's why I thought it'd be interesting, because the demise was right about the beginning of the television time.
Yeah, exactly. So, but it's definitely a confounding factor that you really want to control for.
Okay, thanks.
Great, thanks, Pete. Last question from Ian.
Hi, Stefan. So I was just looking at this slide and seeing like the entry and exit of baseball teams being much larger than in the UK, and this is well ahead of TV. So my first thought was something like sunk costs. So are just like the sunk costs for baseball and football just very different, or are the sunk costs related to your story about institutions?
Thanks. I think I think that gets to the heart of the problem. I think if you're going to, a little bit depends on what you mean by sunk costs. If you're saying, is it an economic argument? I would say in general terms, there isn't an economic case to say that this explains why we see this this kind of variability in the set. And by that I mean, it's nothing to do with the structure of revenue and costs, which explains this. So you could argue that the players were a bit more expensive in the minor leagues. You could argue that the clientele was somewhat more affluent, probably had a higher willingness to pay. You could argue
so
that
the one I was wondering about was whether the costs are recoverable in baseball and they're not in football for some reason that maybe I don't know about.
No, I don't think so, because again, what are your costs? Your costs are players, and your costs are the facility. I mean, one thing that people said at this time is that both the football and the baseball is that the facilities were lousy. And the one explanation widely used in both cases was that declining attendance was because it was such an unpleasant place to go. You know, so I mean, in that sense, I think what's striking is, although the games are very different, actually the underlying economics of staging these events are very, very similar. In fact, almost, I would argue, indistinguishable. I don't know what costs you have in baseball or that you wouldn't have in football, and vice versa.
Okay.
But
my only other thought was whether radio is relevant at all. I don't know if radio changes over this period, whether it means anything with its interaction with TV broadcasts or not. I don't know yet if local radio is very different in the US. Are they broadcasting baseball games? Did the BBC broadcast on radio football games, or were they always just about Test match special?
No, there was football on radio, and there was in the 30s. There was a lot of baseball on radio, and in the early 50s. And certainly, David Surdam, who wrote about this, who is a skeptic about the impact of television, he actually says that he claims that it's more to do with radio in the early 1950s. I don't think that's true. It's not. I mean, I did some tests on this in my baseball paper, but which suggested that wasn't the case. But it's certainly an argument that you can make. But I think, in the end, I think one thing is that there was more baseball on television in the 50s than there was football on television in England.
Yeah.
That's definitely true.
Great. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ian. And that's it. Thank you, Stefan. We've hit 4 p.m. UK. And so thank you very much, Stefan, for a really interesting presentation. Thank you, everyone, for your questions and comments.
Thank you, everybody.
We have one more session before Christmas. So next week we will be back here with Carlos Varela Quintana from the University of Oviedo, presenting Following Our Team on the Road, the impact of top division football clubs on tourism. So thanks again, everyone, and see you all next week.
Thanks. Bye.